Thank you for tuning in to the Operator's Guide on the RP46 and DPM. We've got Ian here today as a consultant specialist to talk to us about how does this gun even exist. Now, this was originally a machine gun, and now this is a semi-automatic version that we have available to us in the United States. How does that happen?
Well, these were actually manufactured by Rick Smith of SMG Guns, who is best known, I think, for his semi-auto FG42s.
Oh yeah, seen on the channel quite a bit, in fact.
Awesome guns. And his son actually used to work for Wiselight.
Okay.
Doing semi-auto conversions of guns like this and Brens and ZB26s.
Oh, they were known for doing a lot of those open bolt conversions, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
A lot of light machine gun to semi-auto conversions. And so Rick, they decided that they wanted to pursue the DP semi-auto conversion because there are a lot of parts kits for DP28s and DPMs in the United States.
Well, they made a lot of these in Soviet Russia.
And elsewhere as well.
Yeah.
A lot of the kits in the U.S. are Polish.
Ah, good point.
Excellent quality. All the Soviet military bloc manufacturing was really quite good quality. So what they did was actually they went through and they started with the basis of the old Wiselight semi-auto conversion, which it does a couple things. The most substantial one is it has to convert the gun from firing from an open bolt to firing from a closed bolt. That's a requirement from ATF. For new manufacturer semi-auto rifles, they have to fire from a closed bolt.
That's usually a pretty tricky conversion too.
Yes, although it gets simpler with guns that don't have fixed firing pins. And the DP did not, from the beginning, have a fixed firing pin.
Okay.
So what they did have to do, though, was put in some sort of semi-auto fire control group. And they chose to go with a hammer-fired design, which is really quite impressive when you look at this up close, because there's not very much space inside the action of this thing to stick a hammer.
No, previous to this, when this was an open bolt gun, this was merely just a sear that would drop down and the bolt would just go under its own spring pressure.
Right.
But now he's managed to fit a hammer system into a fire control group with a hammer into what was just a sear previously.
And not only that, it's a semi-auto trigger that has a really remarkably nice trigger pull.
It's very good, yes.
One of the things you often run into with this sort of, a light machine gun converted to semi-auto, usually they have pretty atrocious triggers.
Yeah.
And this one is really remarkably good. It's one of the best of its type that I've ever run into.
So now I believe this one came from a Polish parts kit. It's got a circle 11 there. Is that correct?
Okay. Oval 11 is Polish.
So what happens is these kits were built over in somewhere in the Eastern Bloc, or as machine guns, and as a result, they wanted to bring them in as parts kits. So the receiver, once a machine gun, is always a machine gun. Those are cut and shredded.
Exactly.
And then what comes in is like barrels, the bolt, the wedges, the bipod, the stock.
Literally every part of the gun except the receiver.
And so what he had to do was manufacture and mill his own new receiver.
Yep. The way a lot of these were originally done is actually by re-welding machine gun receivers.
Ah, okay.
Once they're cut, they're legally nothing, and they can be re-welded in a process of literally manufacturing a new receiver. However, as import processes changed, the cuts required legally got more and more difficult to re-weld.
So destructive that they were almost impossible to repair.
And Rick looked at this and realized the DP receiver is really a pretty simple thing. And he decided it would actually be more cost-effective to manufacture brand new receivers, which also allows them to incorporate all the modifications necessary for semi-auto right in the original construction.
That sounds ambitious, but considering it came from a guy who decided to recreate the FG42
from freaking scratch.
From scratch,
yeah.
This is really even I don't want to say easier, but it's a more understandable project.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, on this one at least, the only part he had to create new, other than some fire control bits, was the receiver.
So now we're going to get into the history of this gun in a minute, but what he did do is recreate the DPM, the modernized version.
They do both the DP28 and the DPM.
Okay.
The really distinctive difference is the pistol grip here on the DPM. The DPM is a much better gun.
Yes.
They made some mechanical improvement. They moved the recoil spring from the underside here, where on the DP28 it was actually wrapped around the gas piston. And the Soviets in World War II discovered that caused problems. When you had a lot of sustained fire, the gas piston heats up, and then the spring heats up, and then the spring loses its temper, and then the gun doesn't work. So they moved the recoil spring back behind the bolt, which required this kind of goofy little add-on tube to give it space.
But not in the way because of the pistol grip.
Exactly.
Yep.
So that's the main change to the DPM.
And then Rick, never being content, decided to double down and went and made something else. So the DP28 and DPM was fed from a 47-round drum magazine.
Yep.
pizza plate of sorts. And what we have now is the RP46 conversion. Now this is something, again, that the Soviets did, and in fact, Rick actually improved upon the original Soviet design and made it, I think, better.
He actually did.
He did, because the original modification required that you actually have to modify the gun, and in this instance you don't. You can actually put his right on. In fact, I think he said you could put this on even an original gun.
Yeah, these will fit on original DP28s and DPMs.
And so he looked at the design and actually said, I can do that better, this better, that better, I don't have to modify the gun, and sure as heck, he pulled it off.
Yeah.
So this fits just like the magazine. I'm not going to put it on right now, but it clips on top, and what this did is it allowed you to convert this 47-round pan-fed gun into a belt feed.
Right.
And that is obviously, there's a huge tactical advantage for that.
Right there. Yeah,
Right
the
here.
Soviets, they had some minor experience with a lot of angry people using belt-fed general-purpose machine guns.
That said, this was a very effective actual system, and it still is. But when you add to the belt feed, you've now come to what is becoming sort of a embryonic PKM.
Right. The Soviets put this together as a way to sort of emulate what the Germans were doing with the universal machine gun concept, with the MG34 and the MG42, of having a gun that could be carried by one person and used in a dynamic tactical role, and could also be set up for sustained fire with, 250 round belts. And so the Soviets looked at this and went, well, what we have is this light machine gun, which is good for running around, and we also have SG-43s and Maxim guns that are great for positional use, but not so much for moving around.
A little hard to move.
The Germans combined these two concepts into a single one, and in order to try and emulate that as best they could, the Soviets adapted their light machine gun to belt-fed. This is actually kind of like what the U.S. did with the 1919, saying, well, we've got this great medium machine gun, but we don't have a light machine gun. The BAR just doesn't do it well. So the U.S. came up with the 1919 A6 that's the same sort of compromise going the other direction.
Fair enough. So let's go through the history of this in general. So
Yeah.
this started off as the DP27, which then quickly became the DP28. What's the difference there, do you know?
Honestly, I don't know.
I don't think there's a lot.
I think it's just people using different dates of adoption.
I think so too.
There is no mechanical difference between the two.
So the DP27/28, as you mentioned earlier, had a recoil spring around the actual piston, which would get heat fatigue during fire, was fed from the same 47-round pan magazine. It had a big lumpy thing here for ground basing. It did not have a pistol grip, and it did not have this recoil assembly.
Right, it had a traditional sort of rifle stock and a grip safety built into it.
Oh, yes, of course.
These guns were full auto only. There was no semi-auto mechanism. They fired from an open bolt. And the safety on the original DP28 was just a grip safety, a squeezy little grip safety.
Squeezy thing.
Yeah.
And the safety now is actually a lever.
Correct.
So they went from that to the DPM, because this was actually a problem. Now, the DP28 was used very effectively in World War II as a general-purpose light machine gun, one that they could move around in the field with, not only by the Soviets, but also by the Finns.
Yes. Yeah, the Finns had a kind of atrocious LS-26 machine gun of their own that they used far more Soviet guns. These pan magazines are awkward to carry and bulky and weird, but they are reliable magazines. They work well. The gun itself is a tremendously effective. It's a very well-designed, well-built gun.
I would say underappreciated in this part of the world.
Yeah.
So, but its effect in World War II was telling. So then they went to the DPM, where they removed the recoil spring from here and turned it into a recoil assembly here in the rear to get rid of that heat fatigue, added a pistol grip, which made it actually far more ergonomic.
Way better. Yeah.
And I believe they changed something on the bipod too, a little bit.
The original DP28 bipod was clamped around the barrel jacket. They replaced that with this sort of cradle sitting on top of the jacket. It's a little better.
And they did modify the gas system slightly, which Rick has not done as of yet. This is still the DP28 gas system.
The DPM and the 28 have the same gas system.
Oh, I'm sorry, when we get to the RP46. So at that point, they had this improved DPM, and the DPM did land up serving in World War II at the end.
Right at the end of World War II.
And they were still feeding from these clumsy, awkward pan feeding devices, and they realized, well, we really need belt feed. And so they had a huge inventory of these light machine guns, and instead, in typical Russian Soviet fashion, how do we make this into something we need it to be without spending a lot more money?
Yeah.
Typically speaking, when we see conversions from, like, for example, a bolt action to a semi-automatic, it's a big Rube Goldberg kludge.
Yeah.
However, I have to say, Russian ingenuity, they pulled it off.
This is slick.
It's
This
very
is really quite slick. It's one of the few conversions like this that ever actually worked well.
So they modified the gun slightly for it to fit, and they actually changed the gas system because the belt feed system does bleed energy from the system to reciprocate the belt.
Right. So in the pan magazine, you've got a spring that does all the feeding.
Yes.
In the belt feed, there isn't one. All the energy required to pull the belt up into the gun, to pull links out of, or to pull rounds out of the links, all that energy has to come from the gas system of the weapon, instead of being supplied by an independent spring that you wind up when you're loading the
So
magazine.
now you're replacing the energy that was in that spring via the cycling of the gun, which is done actually by the charging handle on this, which actuates the belt system.
So yeah, that's what's super cool about this. There's a bolt handle right here on the side of the gun, and in order to actuate the belt feed, they just made this hook that the bolt handle sits in and just slides it back and forth. It's a crude isn't really the right word. It's a very simple and very effective.
I don't think crude is the word. I think it's extremely clever.
Yeah.
But so they took a gun with some minor modifications, which again, Rick did not have to modify his for what he did because he improved it. But this clips on, and you can go back and forth between the original 47 round pans, if you happen to have them, or you can go to belt feed in the field.
Yeah.
And so they've taken this gun that was originally limited by its capacity and turned it into a now much more modern belt-fed light machine gun.
Right.
And this got used quite heavily for a long time, up until the 1960s.
Yeah, in the 60s, the PK was adopted and started replacing the RP46. But you saw this for 10, maybe 15 years being the standard Soviet bloc belt-fed machine gun.
So this became this was, like I said earlier, the embryonic PK.
Right. This took the PK's role while they were working on developing the PK.
And some of the minor deficiencies that existed with the RP46 were things that they learned about and why the PK became developed the way it did. I would say they lightened it up a little bit. They made it a little bit more svelte of a gun.
It's a far handier gun to actually use.
And the feeding system on the PK actually clips onto the gun. It's a 100-round belt, typically, instead of a 250-round belt out of a can.
Right.
So you no longer have to carry the can plus your ammunition plus the gun. The gun, the ammunition, and the can are all one integral thing, and it clips on and off almost like a magazine.
Really, the biggest downside of this system is that there is no way to attach the ammunition to the gun. The problem is you have a gas piston here that you can't really do anything with. You have a bolt handle on this side that has to reciprocate to run the action. It ejects out the bottom and it feeds off the top. And it was never designed with the intention of having to clip on a belt to hold, or a box to hold ammunition. So in the field, what they would have to do is use an ammo can, and you'd have one guy set up the ammo can and then feed it into the gun. And then if you wanted to move the gun, change positions, you basically had to unload the gun, put the ammo back in the can. One guy picks up the gun and moves. One guy takes the ammo. And then you set it back up and reload it once you get to your new position.
I tried it out, and I came to find that as long as, of course, there's not a belt hanging out of the gun, this sling, once you put that bipod out of the way, you can actually move with this gun pretty effectively.
Okay.
So if you need to displace and change positions, as long as you've got two guys working in tandem, one carrying the ammo, one carrying the gun, being able to change positions is not that big of a deal. Right. However, the PK, of course, made it a much more one-man proposition.
And the Germans were able to pull that off in World War II. They had, you'll see little 50-round drum looking attachments to the German machine guns, and those were there to hold a short 50-round belt so that one guy could actually have ammunition attached to the gun while moving. So if he had to set the thing up and immediately fire, he could. That wasn't something you could do with this.
It's fascinating to me to watch the Soviet technology because they look at what their opponents were doing, and they take the best of what the enemy did and then integrate it into their weapon designs.
In a lot of ways, the Soviets took a bunch of really revolutionary German small arms concepts, the assault rifle, the universal machine gun in particular. And the Soviets looked at that and went, we like the idea, we can build these guns a lot better. And they came up with the AK, which is, I would say, pretty undisputably better than the STG. And they came up with the PK, which is, I would say, kind of undisputably better than the MG42 and 34.
And easily defendable, as the PKM right now in the modern world is probably one of the best light belt-fed machine guns in the world.
Yeah, for its role, I don't think there's anything else that come close to it.
However, that gun being stated, all of that originates with this. And so this video is going to be a deep dive in how to run this gun, how to actually adjust the sights, how it functions, everything you need to know as an operator of the RP46 and DPM. So stay tuned for that.
We did not talk about the gas system.
Okay.
Let's do a little bit and see if you can splice it in.
I
We
can.
didn't talk about the changes.
Okay, one sec. Ready? All right, so when they went from the DP28 to the DPM, that was not a change to the gas system. But when they went to the RP46, they absolutely did change the gas system, as we said, because you needed more energy to cycle the belt.
Right. So what they did on the DP, it's kind of interesting in that, I don't know if you can see it from back there, but the gas piston actually comes completely off of the gas block. And so there's only about an inch of travel where the piston is actually under gas pressure when you fire.
And then it immediately vents into the atmosphere.
Exactly. Yeah, which is important so that you can overgas the ammo and it won't damage the gun.
Right.
The problem is, if all of a sudden you have this extra drag on the system from a belt feed adapter, well, the problem is now you don't have enough energy. So what they did is actually redesign the gas block to increase that length of powered travel, like the distance under which the gas piston is actually being actively pushed. And by increasing that, they were able to increase the amount of energy into the system, and presto, the gun works. Now, the problem for today's market with a reproduction like this is these parts kits are very easy to get. RP46 parts kits, not so much. Those are extremely rare. They were never imported in any real volume. So there aren't RP46 gas blocks lying around. That gas block is not quite permanently, but it's semi-permanently attached to the barrel, and the idea of if you had to manufacture a new gas block and you had to get people to like send your barrel in and we'll replace the gas block, and by the way, now it might be too powerful for going back to the pans, that would be a serious problem for someone trying to sell, like Rick, trying to sell the RP46 adapter. So what he did instead is actually modify the flash hider cone by adding basically a flat washer at the front, and he turned what was just a flash hider into a booster. So gas pressure accumulates in here and increases the amount of back pressure on the gas system. That translates into a greater velocity of the bolt carrier moving backward, which gives you the extra energy to run the belt feed with the original DP28 gas block.
I'm consistently impressed by Rick's ingenuity in terms of how he takes designs and makes them work.
Yeah.
And so that's how he fixed the problem on this gun. Of course, the Russians fixed it by changing the gas system entirely.
Right.
However, if you're going from the 47-round drum magazine to the belt feed system, your only modification is to ensure that your gas system is set to the highest setting, and that you put on the booster instead of the cone. Otherwise, you're then good to go.
Exactly.
Pretty impressive.
It's very cool.
The sighting system on the DPM and RP46 is no different than any other Soviet-era equipment like a PPS H41, PPS 43, AKM, AK-74. It's a rear notch and a front post. The leaf in the rear is adjustable from 100 to 1500 meters. This is a little ambitious, but considering this is a light machine gun roll, this would be more like area fire. It probably isn't crazy. All zeroing is done on the gun with the front sight assembly. Let's focus in on that. Okay, as I said earlier, all adjustment for zeroing is done on the front sight assembly of this gun. There's a screw on the left and a screw on the right. This is used to move the front sight left and right. It's a little bit easier than an AKM, which is done with pressure and a plug, so you should be able to just use a screw to do that. You will see there are stadia lines here at the front of the sight assembly so that you can actually retain zero, and once you got your zero, you could mark it or note where the marks are for your particular gun's zero. So, when you are adjusting a front sight for your zero, if your impact is left of the target, you would move the front sight left. If your impact is right of the intended impact, you would move the front sight right. If it is low, you would move the front sight down, and if it was high, you'd move the front sight up. When you are adjusting zero with a front sight assembly, you just chase the impact. So you would set your rear leaf to 100 meters, and then you would move this left or right, up or down, to reflect where the target is being struck by the bullet when you fire at 100 meters. If you were adjusting the rear sight, which you cannot do on this gun, you would do just the opposite. You would move the rear sight left to move the impact left. But with a front sight assembly, you would move the front sight right to move the impact left, move the front sight left to move the impact right, make the front post lower to raise the impact, and make the front sight higher to lower the impact. Once that's done, your zero is done, and any other adjustment was done with the rear sight leaf, nothing more than for elevation. There is no quick windage adjust on this gun. If you're using the gun in the DPM roll with a 47-round drum installed, set to the 100-meter setting, there is not a problem seeing over the drum to the front sight. However, once you install the RP46 unit, which sits a little higher than the drum, you're probably going to want to do your zeroing a little differently. Let's talk about that next. Here we are with the RP46 unit installed. You will see that it does sit a little higher than the 47-round drum in the DPM roll. If you have your rear sight leaf set to 100 meters, very little is left of the front sight post for a proper sight picture because of this issue. So what I would recommend is that if you're going to use the gun in the RP46 roll, would be to set the rear sight leaf probably to 500 meters, which raises it a little bit, and then zeroing with the front sight at whatever distance you want to zero at. So let's say, for example, you want a 100-meter zero. Just go ahead and leave it at a 100-meter zero. With the sight leaf set to 500, 600, or 700 meters, this raises the sight leaf a little bit, and it gives you clearance over the RP46 conversion unit to have a nice, clean sight picture. This problem exists in the original RP46 and is no different on this conversion unit that you're seeing today. All right, let's talk about the field strip and cleaning of the RP46. This, of course, also applies to the DPM. However, with the RP46, the feeding device is the belt feed mechanism, so that's the thing you would remove. In a DP28 or DPM, you would be removing the drum mag. So you pull back on the magazine release and pop this up slightly, get the handle out of the way, move these two clips, and the RP46 feeding device has been removed from the gun. Now we're back to the original DPM configuration. This does not require field strip besides just external wiping, cleaning, and lubrication. So for now, we'll set this to the side. All right, at this point, we of course, because this is now a semi-automatic variant of the DPM, we want to ensure that the gun is empty and clear. So we'll pull back on the charging handle, look into the chamber, verify that it is empty. In the original DPM or DP28 or RP46 for that matter, this would be an open bolt gun, so that'll be a slightly different procedure. Now that we've verified the gun is empty, the next step we're going to do is remove the sling. Just from the rear, we don't need to remove the sling from the front. So at the next point after that, we will then take off the actual recoil spring. There is a detent here, which you will push back and then turn clockwise, at which point it will pop off. The recoil spring will come out. Good to go on that. There is on this side, there is a screw, which at this point we will actually unscrew in a normal fashion. Once that screw comes off, set it to the side, and now the actual bottom will come off as such. This is your sear assembly. In this gun, this now has a hammer assembly. The original would have nothing more than a sear because it was open bolt. Set that to the side. Once that is off, you can then pull this charging handle back, and your entire op rod, locking system all come out. At this point, you have the wedges exposed, and you can then clean, do whatever you need to do. You don't really need to tear this down further than this. This is here for you to now wipe down, clean however you see fit. Set that to the side. To get to the barrel, you can see that this is actually a rather deep receiver. You can clean from this side, which is of course what you want to do. You never want to clean from the front. That's sort of annoying in regards to how deep that actual, I shouldn't say receiver, but this entire assembly is. But because this is meant to be a light machine gun, the actual barrel is quick removable. It does help to have a wrench. You don't necessarily need it, but when the gun's hot or carboned up, it will matter. There is a button on the left side. You depress the left button, put your wrench onto the barrel, and then turn. And at that point, once it is turned as such, this barrel will now actually pop out, a little bit of wiggling, and the barrel is out. You can see there's interrupted threads here cut into the barrel. This is not only convenient for cleaning, as you can now get to the breech of the barrel for cleaning right here without having to deal with the actual receiver. And as well as if the gun were hot in the field, you could remove the barrel, install a new clean barrel that is not hot, and continue firing. So that is really, for all intents and purposes, the field strip that we need to worry about right now. You could wipe these surfaces down, clean them off, clean the barrel, clean the insides, and then let's put the gun back to its original functional configuration. So first, everything in reverse. We'll put the barrel back in. Slides in, kind of wiggle it a little bit till you find that spot, push the button, and as you see, the barrel should actually be indexed. The gas piston and system indexed this way. Once it's down all the way, then you, as you saw it just popped, turn it back. This is a Russian gun, and sometimes a mallet is useful. Once that's there, you can wiggle it a little bit just to make sure it's locked. The button should pop, and it did. So the barrel has now been properly reinstalled. At this point, we can turn the gun upside down, and we can install our bolt and our op rod. There are guide rails on the rear that feed in. Once that's there, just close it all the way, as such. Now, we can put our stock and fire control group back in. Just levers down and in, hold it in place, and literally the screw back in. The screw is not captured. You could lose that in the field. That would be a bad thing. Right? Once that's in, that is done. Return the spring assembly into the rear tail assembly. There it goes. Push this back into the gun from the rear. There are two lugs that will index. Once it's in all the way, turn it counterclockwise until this detent snaps back into place. So here we see the DP28 or the RP46 in its field stripped condition. And Rick has done a masterful job in converting what was an open bolt sear fired machine gun into a hammer fired gun. You can see that he's actually taken the bottom trigger fire control group and modified it very slightly where it really doesn't take any extra surface area than it would have with the normal sear, but found a way to devise a hammer. There's a safety here that's clicked. Once that is clicked, at that point, this hammer will actually fire, and you should not do this normally, but I'm going to go ahead and do it once. Once the bolt has actually disengaged this, it will now fire by going forward, and that is actually what fires the gun. This is an incredibly simple modification in terms of how elegant it is from replacing a sear with a hammer control group, or excuse me, hammer fired gun. But in that regard, I'm very impressed by how much this really continues to be just like the original gun, and it has an actually excellent trigger pull where you can get really good rates of fire out of this just in semi-auto. However, how does this work in general? So once this gun is in battery, so this means that this is forward like this, the gas piston is against the gas system, the cup around that gas piston there. What happens is this goes back like this, and this is a wedge locking system. These two wedges, when it is in battery, extend forward to the left and to the right into recessors in the receiver. This is what keeps the gun locked during the firing cycle. Once the gun is fired, obviously the bullet travels down the barrel, gas is filtered down the piston, which hits this operating rod, which then retracts the bolt, thus retracting the wedges. So the flaps in battery are open. Then once the gas system retracts, it pulls it back out of battery, and you can see that those wedges close in, allowing the gun to then cycle and chamber another round. You will see other flap locking systems like this on other guns, although they're not that common. The Germans experimented with this flap locking system with the G41 and G43, a couple other weapons as well. But of course, this predates that, and so this is really a very interesting system in which in battery, we go forward, op rod there, these wedges are extended into the receiver, thus providing a locking surface. Once the gun's fired, the gas system, the op rod goes backwards, taking the gun out of, unlocking these locking surfaces and allowing it to cycle back, chamber a new round, and prepare to fire. All right, let's talk about the gas system for a moment. The actual legitimate RP46 had a different gas system than the DP28. This still has the original DP28 gas system, as it's a conversion from a DPM semi-auto to an RP46. This means that to have enough gas to run the system with the RP46 belt feed conversion on it, you have to ensure that the gas system is set to the highest setting and that you have installed the booster. So you remove the cone and replace it with the booster, which is part of the kit. We've already done that so far. All right, let's talk about how the gas system on the DP28 and DPM actually work. This is nothing more than a cap with a cotter pin holding on. There's a vent hole. This is so we can get the gas system apart. Not too much there. There's actually a gas plug with a spigot right here, and there are 3 holes drilled in this gas plug, large, medium, and small. For the RP46 conversion, since this is not an RP46 gas system, we need the largest gas hole drilled into the regulator facing the gas port in the barrel so that we get the most gas into the system. The actual gas does not impinge on this action very long, and you'll see why in a moment. Once the gun fires and the round passes through the barrel and the gas is spigoted off into this gas plug, it is then pushed down into this spigot, in which the op rod has nothing more than a cup around the spigot. When enough gas fills the system, it will start to push back the op rod, which has a cup around it, off of this spigot. The minute the op rod passes the end of the spigot, this immediately vents into the atmosphere. So you have a very short duration gas impulse going on with the DP28 gas system, which is why they changed it for the RP46 to give it more energy for the belt feed mechanism. Because the minute we get here, we're venting to the atmosphere. And this is why it's important for us to have this on the highest gas setting with the booster installed for this to work with the RP46 conversion kit. You do not necessarily have to have this on the highest gas setting when you're just running it as a DPM with standard 47 round drums. At any rate, we've removed the spring from the system to reduce tension. We can pull the op rod back and out of the way. So at that point, to disassemble the gas system, we have to bend this cotter pin to get it, to pull it out. As such, don't lose that. This just unscrews. Again, nothing more really than a cap to hold the system in place. But before we do that, we actually have to turn the barrel to be able to get it out of the system. So I'm going to push the button, as we talked about earlier in the video, and turn the barrel. All right, so now we can actually get that gas plug out. With the gas plug indexed away from the actual receiver, tap it, should pop right out if it's nicely lubed and cleaned. You will see now, as I said earlier, there actually are visibly the largest hole, the medium hole, and the smallest one. And the smallest hole is completely filled with carbon. This doesn't matter as we're not trying to adjust to any of these settings, but if you wanted to clean this out, you can actually punch this out with like a little steel punch. The carbon is quite hard. That's the way to do that. But if you need to get this to the highest setting, which this is the highest setting, again, you want to index that largest port to the barrel. There are index notches there that will lock it into place. Tap it lightly to make sure it's there. Once that's in, screw this back on. Line it up with the hole. As such, doesn't really matter all that much. Like that, and then just bend the cotter pin. Boom, you're done. Now you need to return the barrel to its original location. Index point. Again, the mallet helps. And now you can see the gas cup will actually go back right over the spigot as it was originally. We're now done with the gas system. So that's how you would remove it, adjust it for the gas setting, and clean it as well. The RP46 with the RP46 belt feed conversion removed is of course now just a DPM, which is a modernization of the DP28. So at that point we put the conversion unit to the side and this can with the belted ammunition to the side because that's not relevant to us. We're going back to the old way from World War II, which are 47 round drum magazines. Canvas cases like these hold 3 of these drums. There were metallic cases as well that looked very similar to these belt cans that also held a small number of these drums. The problem with these drums, besides the fact that when they're actually on the gun, they kind of impede some of your situational awareness and sight picture, is the loading process. They're extremely slow to load. So how to load them is you bend back that hook and you compress the spring by pulling it this way. As you pull it, it exposes one location for one round, which you drop into the drum as such. Then you move it one more slot. Then you load one more. Move it one slot. Move it one more. One slot. And you do that 47 times to load one drum. So at this point you'd remove the empty magazine by retracting the magazine release here to the rear and pulling the drum up and off of the receiver. Putting that to the side, we now have a drum that's barely partially loaded. There's a couple rounds here in this drum. You would guide these teeth under these guides in the front, align it with the rear, and then smack it sharply. At that point, we're now seated and we need to chamber around. With your hand underneath the charging handle, you will run the action and you will see that the drum turned, chambering one round. We are now ready to fire however many rounds are left in this particular drum. Okay, so we're here in the DPM configuration and we want to install our RP46 conversion unit. You can do so without removing the recoil spring, but I find it easier to do so because you have to align this mechanism with the charging handle, which is what runs the belt feed mechanism. So to do so, again, just retract this detent and turn the recoil spring assembly clockwise, removing the spring and thus reducing pressure or taking all pressure off of the bolt carrier group. Retract the bolt carrier group about midway. Take your conversion unit, line these teeth up just like you would with a drum, and clip it onto this shroud. Then line up this handle with the charging handle to the rear and then smack it sharply. That should seat all the way. Put the charging handle forward, return the spring to the system. Once the spring is returned, you are now ready for a belt feed system. Good to go. You can see the mechanism working inside if you open the lid, as such. And as I retract this, there's the system cycling as it should. Let's go through the process of loading a belt into the gun. There are 2 ways to load this gun. With the cover open, take out your belt, line it onto your tray, and ensure that the rim of the first cartridge is behind the arm or the pawl, the feed pawl, which was just discussed a moment ago. With that all aligned, close the cover. With it closed, run the action. You'll see it cycled and there's now a round in the chamber. Let's see that again with the cover open from the right side. Pull the belt out of the can, put it on the feed tray, align the rim behind the feed pawl arms, make sure they're all lined up, close the cover. With the cover closed, run the action once, and you're ready to go. Now let's talk about the most common loading procedure, which would be with the cover closed. Pull the belt out of the can. It does not have to be the first round in the belt. Put the starter tab through from the right side and just pull it through. And until it clicks and will go no further. Once it will go no further, run the action once. That has now snapped those feed pawls over the rim and aligned around with the chamber. Cycle it a second time, and you're now ready to fire. You have to run the action twice when you feed the gun this way. After that, you're ready to go until the belt has been depleted. To unload, open the cover, pull the belt off of the feed tray, run the action once, and the round's been dumped. So in conclusion, hopefully you've enjoyed this operator's guide to the DP28 and RP46 modification. Rick at SMG Guns has done an incredible job with these semi-automatic conversions of the DP28, and thus also adding on the RP46 belt feed conversion. This is an opportunity here on the American market to experience a firearm that had incredibly historical significance, not only on the Eastern Front, but post-World War II, in terms of the belt feed and what ultimately led up to what is now the PK and PKM. So if you want to experience either the 47-round drum-fed DP28 or add on the RP46 belt feed unit, go to SMG Guns right now and check it out. I want to go ahead and tell you that these are not T&E guns. We did buy these directly. This was purchased by InRange because I wanted one, because they're that cool, as was the RP46 unit. So these are not freebies. This is not a shill or sponsored ad. This is strictly me experiencing an incredibly cool firearm that's historically significant and bringing it to you, the audience. If you like that kind of content, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon is what allows us to be able to do things like this. It is you, the audience, that keeps InRange TV alive. Not advertising money, nothing like that, because we're completely viewer supported. Also, please check out InRange.tv for all 5 of our distribution networks and more coming in the future. Thank you very much.